Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's explainer. We have a truly massive, incredibly fascinating, and frankly, intensely personal piece of work to dive into today. We're going to spend some serious time unpacking a 33-part music and philosophy manifesto. Now, I want to be clear right off the bat, this isn't just a random playlist of songs someone threw together on a weekend. Not at all. It is a meticulously crafted, deeply intentional framework designed to map out human darkness. It's built to completely deconstruct our rigid realities, and ultimately, it aims to find a working spiritual compass in what often feels like a completely chaotic world. It is profound, it is gritty, it is sometimes quite uncomfortable, and it absolutely challenges some of our most fundamental, deeply ingrained perceptions of world history and society. We're going to take our time really breaking this down, and I am thrilled to guide you through this complex landscape. So let's get right into it. Okay. Let's dive into this, because I know exactly what you're thinking looking at this question. You're probably sitting there wondering, what on earth could a legendary German street rapper like Sido, a North Korean dictator like Kim Jong-un, and a 30-something guy searching for spiritual awakening possibly have in common? On the surface, it literally sounds like the setup to a strange joke. It's a completely bizarre combination of concepts and figures. But, that is exactly the magic of the document we are looking at today. All of these figures, all of these vastly, vastly different worlds connect perfectly in what the author calls Part 1, Darkness, of this manifesto. As we'll see, the author weaves these completely disparate elements together for a very specific purpose, to violently tear down the everyday filters through which we view the world. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the 33-part Music Manifesto itself. Then, we'll break down the mask of dogmatism, follow the transition into catharsis and urban reality, and make our departure into the unknown. After that, we'll explore the philosophical concept of transurfing and ego dissolution, and finally arrive at the spiritual turning point. Starting with Section 1, the 33-part Music Manifesto. Let's set the foundation. To really understand the depths of this explainer, we first have to understand the deeply personal premise the author has established. And the number 33 is the absolute anchor of this entire project. The author created this manifesto exactly at the age of 33. Now, as you might know, 33 is historically and culturally recognized as the classical Jesus age. And according to the text, setting this profound philosophical milestone right at this exact age is a very, very deliberate choice. The author feels a deeply rooted, highly personal spiritual connection to the figure of Jesus and the broader concept of enlightenment. But I want to pause here, because what makes this so compelling is the grounding. It's incredibly easy for people to explore concepts of enlightenment at age 33 and fall completely off the deep end into a God complex. But the text explicitly emphasizes that the author is using this framework strictly as an internal, functional spiritual compass. He's using it to navigate absolute darkness, and he's doing so with complete clarity and heavily reflected self-awareness. He knows he isn't Jesus. He isn't claiming to be a Messiah. He's simply using this historical resonance, this connection, to avoid losing his grip on reality or falling into megalomania. It gives the whole manifesto an enormous, brutally honest depth right from the very first page. And this brilliantly illustrates how that grounding is practically applied. The author divides the full 33-part manifesto into 3 distinct courses. Think of it like a massive 3-course philosophical meal. Today, in this explainer, we are exclusively looking at the first course, which is titled Part 1, Darkness. This part consists of 11 carefully curated songs, and these 11 tracks aren't just thrown together randomly on shuffle. They are meticulously organized into 4 distinct narrative phases of descent and transformation. As you can see, we move from the destruction of dogmas into a desperately needed cleansing, down into the gritty, raw reality of the street, and finally a launch outward into the cosmos. Which brings us to Section 2, the mask of dogmatism. This is the first phase of the playlist journey. Let's really look at how this manifesto musically deconstructs authoritarianism, because the curation here is wild. The journey into darkness actually begins with a heavy, almost disorienting dose of self-irony. The very first track is Colors by the rapper DCVDNS. The text explains that this song acts as a deceptive, colorful facade. It's essentially a sarcastic invitation that tries to sell you the devil in the darkest human abysses, but it's all wrapped up in a playful, almost mocking mask. But the manifesto doesn't let us stay comfortable for long. That colorful mask is brutally, violently ripped off by the second track, which is Seta Kwakur's Sharia law. This is a jarring pivot. The text points out that this track represents the unvarnished, harsh reality of the devil we were just introduced to. It is the sonic, visceral manifestation of absolute dogmatism and brutal oppression. However, as the source material notes, every rigid system inherently carries the seeds of its own destruction. So the manifesto then transitions into a series of dark wave remixes, specifically a Boy Harsher remix, which musically marks the death of these dogmas. The rigid, oppressive world of Sharia law is declared dead. It becomes pure history. This feeling of emotional liberation is then finalized by another remix titled Dark Cheese Obsession Killer, which the author uses to expose this despotism as nothing more than a destructive obsession, effectively eliminating it from the sonic landscape. And then, just when you think you have a handle on the sound, the manifesto makes a radical, incredibly jarring genre switch to uncompromising raw street punk with the band Loikami and their track Goodnight White Pride. Now, the author makes a very specific, very sharp parallel here that we need to unpack. The text argues impartially that the despotic dynamics of Middle Eastern extremism, the kind explored in the earlier tracks, can be mapped one-to-one onto the current reality of radical white settlers and ultra-Orthodox fanatics seizing power. The author states that the underlying mechanics of extreme dogmatism are exactly the same regardless of the ideology. For the author, the inclusion of this punk track acts as a universal musical middle finger to every single form of racist and totalitarian supremacy. The text uses this progression to completely shatter the illusion that dogmatism is just some theoretical construct of the past or something that only happens far away. It's here and it needs to be dismantled. Moving on to Section 3, Catharsis and Urban Reality. We're transitioning into the second and third phases of the music. So the system is broken. The dogmas have been shattered by punk and dark wave. But you can't just destroy a dogma and leave a massive vacuum, right? The manifesto deeply recognizes that after destruction, a desperately needed purification must take place. You have to clean up the wreckage. This phase is perfectly represented by DJ Cozy's Das Klares Wasser remix, which literally translates to the Clear Water remix. The text describes this track as a powerful symbol for evolutionary flow and profound change. The clear water literally, sonically, washes away the devil and all that accumulated toxic baggage we just confronted in the first few tracks. It cleanses the soil. It makes room for something entirely new to grow. And what exactly grows on this newly fertile, purified foundation? The answer is a massive, driving, incredibly intense techno anthem called Oxyatomone. The text positions this specific track as the central anchor of the entire first part of the manifesto. It takes the quiet catharsis of the clear water and transforms it into a powerful, collective, and highly energetic departure. It's the sound of momentum building. But the momentum doesn't stay in the club. From that high-energy techno-catharsis, the path leads straight back down into the unforgiving reality of the streets. The manifesto literally crashes into the raw, unapologetic trap house sound of Lil Jin's Shake Junt. This brings in the gritty aesthetics of skate culture and heavily leans into the classic, heavy Memphis and Atlanta trap sound. The text makes a point to highlight a deliberate, codeine-influenced, slowed-down tempo here. It introduces a completely new, heavy, psychedelic sluggishness to our journey through the darkness. This sluggishness sets up a perfect, hazy transition into the next track, DJ Smokey's Smoked Out Dance Party. And there is a truly fascinating backstory here noted in the source material that we need to talk about. This track connects directly to Hein Kummer, who is much better known globally by his legendary skater pseudonym, Versace Plug. Now, despite being widely recognized as one of the most talented and influential skateboarders of modern times, with well over 527,000 followers on Instagram, he remains an absolute, unapproachable phantom. He avoids the limelight completely, he doesn't do interviews, he runs an extremely low-key brand called Flight Tech with his brother, and he just stays out of the mainstream machine. The author's inclusion of this specific track breathes that exact uncommercial, raw, highly authentic street energy from their early, gritty skate sessions in Bremen. This entire urban backdrop then finds its logical geographic conclusion in Sido's absolute German rap classic, Mein Block. The manifesto draws a brilliant direct line here. It argues that the raw energy, the haze, the attitude, and the hard realities celebrated in the US trap scene are mirrored one-to-one in the German concrete underground. It's the exact same vibe, just a different language and a different block. This is where the culture actually lives, breathes, and survives in the darkness. Which brings us to Section 4, Departure into the Unknown. As comfortable as the familiarity of the block might be, the manifesto does not allow us to just stay lingering in the concrete. We have to keep moving. The final act of this first third of the playlist is delivered by the track Voltraum, which translates to Space, by Cara Capaccio. According to the text, this track acts as a literal catapult. It is described as a radical, jarring cut. It violently rips us out of the familiar, gritty urban environment of the block that we just spent so much time exploring, and it shoots us directly up into the absolute infinity of the cosmos. The manifesto heavily emphasizes that this departure is a conscious, incredibly painful, but absolutely necessary leaving of one's own comfort zone. The message is clear. You simply cannot grow if you stay on the block forever. You have to be willing to break out into the completely unknown, even if it's terrifying. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the author philosophically seals this entire first musical act. The manifesto uses a quote from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, but it's specifically translated into Low German, a very grounded regional dialect. The quote is, "Glaub kein Gedanken, der nicht bei Wind und Began entstanden ist." Translated, this means, do not believe any thought that was not born in the wind and in motion. Let's just pause and think about that for a second. It is an incredibly powerful reminder that perfectly wraps up our musical departure. The core argument here is that true knowledge, true enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it, never arises in comfortable standstill. It doesn't happen when you're just chilling in your comfort zone. It has to be fought for in rough movement. It has to be born in the wind. You absolutely have to leave the familiar behind if you want to find any kind of truth in the darkness. Section 5, Transsurfing and Ego Dissolution. This is where the explainer gets heavily philosophical. Okay, so we've completed the 11 tracks of the Darkness playlist. We've been launched into the cosmos. But to truly penetrate the philosophical depths of this cosmos we've been shot into, the text argues that we need an entirely new cognitive tool. We need to shift from just listening to a music playlist to real-world philosophical application. The manifesto formally introduces the concept of transsurfing, which it equates directly with what it calls the philosophy of psilocybin. The text states that while these two terms might sound related to different fields, at their absolute core, they do the exact same thing. They are essentially heavy-duty cognitive tools used for one primary purpose: breaking open the human ego. They are designed to deconstruct our rigid, socially learned realities and to completely dissolve the deeply held illusion that absolute, unshakable monsters exist in the real world. The entire goal of this philosophical framework is to radically, ruthlessly question the one-dimensional, firmly established roles of world history that we have all been taught to just accept blindly since we were kids. Let's move to and see how this builds in a real-world geopolitical context, because the text provides some absolutely wild examples. The first example the author uses to illustrate this ego-dissolving philosophy is the incredibly bizarre, highly publicized relationship between former NBA star Dennis Rodman and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Think about our learned reality regarding Kim Jong-un. It is simple, it is one-dimensional, and it is universally agreed upon. He is a brutal, terrifying, completely unapproachable dictator. End of story. But the author points out a fascinating shift that happened. Rodman was perhaps the very first person from the Western world to walk into that country, look at this terrifying dictator, and simply see a human being who is passionately, obsessively interested in the game of basketball. By applying this completely unbiased, incredibly banal perspective, just talking about hoops, the learned reality was completely dismantled. Even if just for a moment, the heavy mask of the untouchable tyrant was removed. Why? Because he was perceived on a fundamental, incredibly banal human level. He wasn't the supreme leader, he was just a guy talking about the Chicago Bulls. That is transurfing. It's looking past the towering monster to see the mundane human underneath. The manifesto then provides a second and frankly even more jarring example of transurfing, Osama bin Laden. Now, our learned reality here is probably the most solidified of any figure in modern history. The learned reality portrays him as the ultimate, absolute, pure embodiment of anti-Western terrorism. But the author highlights what actually happened when intelligence agencies finally got a look behind the curtain after his compound was raided. The actual contents of bin Laden's private hard drives revealed a profound, almost comical contradiction. According to the text, he possessed a deep, undeniable fascination for the exact Western pop culture that he officially waged a holy war against. The hard drive showed he collected Japanese anime like Naruto. He was a passionate player of the video game Counter-Strike, and he apparently spent time watching viral internet videos. Let that sink in for a moment. The architect of the most devastating terrorist attack in modern history was hanging out playing Counter-Strike. The manifesto argues that this pop cultural banality completely, utterly collapses his absolute identity as a mythological monster. It doesn't absolve him of his crimes, obviously, but it completely destroys the one-dimensional caricature we've built of him in our heads. Through the specific lens of transurfing, the author reaches a profound conclusion. He concludes that bin Laden wasn't just born as some abstract, mythological tyrant who magically appeared out of thin air. Instead, the text argues that he was a deeply contradictory, flawed human existence. And, impartially reporting the author's specific stance here, the text makes the argument that this contradictory human was radicalized, shaped, and ultimately pushed into the role of the ultimate monster by ruthless U.S. imperialism. Again, this is transurfing in action. It breaks open the supposed absolutes of the world. It forces us to acknowledge a very uncomfortable truth, that beneath the darkest, most terrifying mask of tyranny you can find, if you dig deep enough, you will almost always find the banal, vulnerable, or deeply corrupted reality of a completely normal human being. It strips away the mythology and leaves us with just corrupted humanity.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, the spiritual turning point. Let's bring this all together.
So, the crucial point is coming all the way back to the creator of this project. Behind all of this intense music curation, behind the punk rock destruction of dogmas, behind the transurfing of global dictators and terrorists, stands the author himself. At that highly symbolic age of 33 we talked about at the beginning, he experiences what the text describes as a moment of fundamental enlightenment and absolute clarity. He is actively using this spiritual connection to the Jesus age, not as an ego trip, not to say, look at me, I have all the answers, but purely as an internal, functional compass. This internal compass is precisely what allows him to successfully tear down the filters of his own learned reality. It gives him the framework to completely reorder how he perceives humanity, how he perceives history, and how he navigates the world around him without being consumed by the darkness he is studying. And honestly, what is truly staggering to me is the sheer scope of this project. Think about everything we have discussed in this explainer today. The 11 dense tracks, the breakdown of totalitarian dogmatism, the jarring journey to the cosmos, the psychological transurfing of world-famous tyrants, all of this depth was literally just part one. It merely mapped the pure darkness. It was just laying the foundation. There are still two entirely separate 11-part sections remaining in this massive 3-course manifesto. The source material heavily teases that having survived the darkness, the next stages will shift focus to explore the light, ultimately leading to a final, definitive departure from this duality altogether. It's an incredibly ambitious setup. Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought to close on today. If this manifesto successfully proves that even our most terrifying, seemingly unshakable historical monsters are ultimately just vulnerable, contradictory humans hiding behind carefully constructed masks, it begs a massive, almost intimidating question. I want you to really look around your own life, your own society, and your own learned realities. What other absolute truths have you accepted without a second thought? What monsters or saviors do you believe in simply because you were taught to? And perhaps more importantly, what will happen when you finally decide to use a tool like transurfing to deconstruct them? Think about that as you go about your week. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredibly deep dive into the darkness, and I cannot wait to see you in the next explainer.